Well, Israel has, of course, already described any new leader chosen by the existing regime as a potential target, while Donald Trump has called the choice of Khamenei's son unacceptable. Well, for more on this, we are now joined by Nega Angha, who joins us on the line from London. She is a visiting fellow with King's College London and was also a senior advisor at the US Department of State and National Security Council under the Biden administration. Welcome to the program. Thank you so much for your time. First of all,
thank you for having me.
Maybe let's look at, was there any doubt that those assembled would choose a successor who kind of embodies continuity? Do we know if there were many differing viewpoints going into that assembly meeting where they took a week to decide on a successor?
I mean, we can only speculate. We weren't inside, but absolutely, there will be discussions. It's like a horse race. You'll have different parties having opinions on who should be the next supreme leader. I think there is quite a bit of decisions. Obviously, this has been a constant evolution over the last several weeks of what the succession would look like. But one of the things that was important that stood out, and there was sort of a cohesion of thought between the various members, was that we need to show the world defiance and continuity. So naming Mojtaba Khamenei in the middle of a war, the system is essentially telling not only the world, but also domestically, that we're not collapsing, we're not blinking. We are doubling down as a security state. And that was presented very loud and clear. But we also need to bear in mind, usually in wartime, regimes choose loyalty and control, not necessarily consensus. So this was to be expected. We'll have to see how this transpires next. Again, so much can change over the next several days and weeks.
As you say, they're sending a message to the outside world, but also to the Iranian people. And from the US and Israeli point of view, and from the point of view of the Iranian people, it would appear there was really no point in killing Ali Khamenei at all if he's going to be simply replaced by a clone.
That's a fair point, but I think that is essentially what ends up, transpiring is you're going to, the regime is built upon layers. It is not necessarily a thin bench like you would find in other countries. So the essence that there are, various layers to work through is sort of the reality of the Iran regime's apparatus. They have been working now for years on finding ways of a succession, of aligning various different and grooming various different potential members of, essentially a younger IRGC and clerical sort of representatives that could work alongside them for quite some time. So this was to be expected, but there's layers. Again, if for whatever reason this, essentially baby Khamenei is not to continue in his role, there are plenty others within the apparatus that could be selected by the security regime.
So do you think that, Israel has already said, as we've said, anybody appointed by the regime will automatically be a target if, given that they appear to have infiltrated quite successfully the Iranian top deck, if you like, if the Israelis succeed in eliminating this person, will they just go down and down, picking similar leaders?
One could assume that based on what we've seen over the last several weeks. I think, though, I think Israel essentially would give the opportunity to President Trump, who has articulated that he wants to be the one that supports or selects the next leader. I think, obviously that's rhetoric, but I think there's quite a bit that we can assume from that statement that he made. Is he's essentially trying to gauge whether or not this is a leader that he can work with or not? Will there be a diplomatic off-ramp in a potential conversation? Will this new leadership be willing to make some sort of deal? Again, whatever that deal would consist of, that would be the off-ramp. I think, again, the Trump administration is definitely gauging whether there's an opportunity for that or not. I think before Israel, for example, were to take some sort of action, as you shared.
Just give us an idea, who is on this 88-member Council of Clerics? I'm guessing, as they're all clerics, there are no women on it. Who makes it up? How do they decide who the new leader might be?
Again, these are clerics who have gone through religious training, and they maintain different thematic expertise. Mojtaba himself was a mid-ranking cleric. He wasn't considered a senior cleric during this selection process, but they all come with different expertise, different sort of leadership roles, or whether it was leadership roles within many of which were in the Iran-Iraq war, many of which who had different affiliations with different parts of the security apparatus. So the profiles were quite rich, but again, when you look through the various profiles, it's quite clear that it all sort of ties back to the security apparatus, who has control over the economics and the politics and then the security of the country.
So what can you tell us about this new supreme leader? He's been very little, it seems, he has very rarely appeared in public, if ever, very much a backroom person, it seems, very anti-Western attitudes. What else do we know about him, his views? What have been his formational ideas, if you like? I gather his wife was killed in the early stages of the war. That might impact on his next move. So what do we know about him?
That is the part that is disconcerting. I think there's quite a bit of folks trying to read the tea leaves on him, but very little, as you said, has been shared about him. He has been in the shadows, working and aligning himself very closely to the IRGC. He is not necessarily considered a popular person. He hasn't made any sort of grand speeches. Barely has anyone heard his voice. And yet he spent the time working behind the scenes, sort of projecting and being a young commander like the rest of the IRGC. So in terms of that apparatus, he's been, working with the institutional backing. But what we do know, some sort of expressions about who he may be is that he's even more ruthless than his father. And I think, as you put your finger on it too, he has lost his family throughout these recent attacks. So in terms of even human nature, you become even more one could say predict sort of revengeful, but he is a new face, and he is going to essentially potentially rule with more of an iron fist than his father did, because he has been working with the IRGC in lockstep for so many years. But the most that we have been able to hear from him is that he will continue to operate with a security fist, probably even more aggressively than his father.
It seems there were some reservations beforehand about appointing him simply because he was the son of Ayatallah Ali Khamenei, and that might look too hereditary, look like some sort of monarchy. And of course, the Islamic Republic was set up to end the idea of monarchical rule in Iran. Do you think in the end that's going to matter greatly?
I think that's one of the central ironies, given the fact that a hereditary sort of succession occurred, and trying to avoid these family trust regimes. not necessarily because it's not ideologically consistent, but it becomes, more operationally convenient. But what you can sort of predict based on this is that he probably did not have a strong footing to become the next successor, prior to his father being assassinated. But since the assassination of his father, he was sort of propped up even more in order to present, again, a united front, to be able to show symbolically and optically that, we continue to remain in this more sort of cohesive nature, that we continue to support the same, playbook and rules in terms of how we operate as the IRGC, as the Islamic regime. So I think his selection was quite symbolic, more so than anything else.